My name's Jacob Ansari. I do security governance for Block, which is Square, and Cash App, and Afterpay, and a few other things. Prior to that, I was a QSA for about 20 years. I think the term now is recovering QSA. I don't know how much recovery there is in store for me, but enough about that. Before we dive in, I want to give just a quick disclaimer. If all you're looking to do with AI and third-party security evaluation is kind of collect your third party's attestations of compliance and evaluate them, this is actually pretty straightforward. You could probably use ChatGPT or Gemini or something like that to build the bones of that in the time that I'm standing here talking to you about it. And we've, in fact, done this at our organization where we built a process that we feed it the AOCs from our respective third parties, and it will evaluate them and say things like, is this AOC current or is it expired? What services does it cover? Has the third party used a compensating control or a customized approach for anything? And then we can use those responses for follow-up questions or for our internal analytics or things like that. I do need to credit my colleague, Rob Gordon, who is unfortunately not here, for building that into like a good and sustainable program for our organization. But we also wanted to do some more sophisticated things with our third-party security evaluations, and I suspect you do as well. In the doing, we ended up writing kind of a new governance framework within our organization to evaluate third parties. And I don't want to fall down that particular rabbit hole, but it did prompt some particular things that we wanted to do, and that shaped how we wanted to use some tools to help automate the process. One of the relevant points is that we really don't like the kind of endless yes-no questionnaire questions that are the bulk of most third-party security evaluations. Nobody loves filling them out, and I don't really think anybody likes reading them. And instead, we wanted to sort of index on what we call the high-value, high-fidelity kind of upper right quadrant. And what I mean by that is that the high-value part is what is the information that is most useful to us. If we're talking about like a SaaS provider that we want to do business with that operates in a public cloud like AWS or GCP or something like that, do we really care that much about their physical security policy? Maybe not. Do we care about how well they integrate with our SSO? Yes, we care quite a bit about that. So that's the high value part. And the high fidelity is the how do we have any assurance about the quality of answers that we're getting, right? And if we give them the questionnaire, right, the account executive hands it to the intern who ticks yes on all the boxes at midnight the night before it's due, not great. But instead, if we can either like empirically verify something by observing it or looking at it in their developer documentation, or if we can obtain some sort of assurance from a third-party audit report, that's the kind of high fidelity aspect of that. So the idea is we take those inputs, right, an audit report, developer documentation, other things like that, feed it into the AI tool, and then see how it conforms to our security standards. Okay, and like any good project, this has to serve a number of different masters. One is that we need sustainable automation, right? Like I think everybody else on Earth, our VenSec process is understaffed and underappreciated and needs more sustainable automation to keep pace with the number of third parties with whom we do business and the ability to demonstrate that we're evaluating them appropriately. We also need like accuracy and consistency, right? Not just that we need variability, or we don't need variability from one human to the other, or how good of a day they're having, or anything like that. We also want to try to smooth out some of the variations that an LLM will give you. You ask ChatGPT the same question 5 different times, you're not going to get 5 exact answers. You're going to get variances. So having yet another variable that can give you inconsistencies is a thing to be managed. We do need to improve process visibility, both for external parties and for our own organization. So when our auditors come along and say, how do you do this? Show us your third-party management program. There's the ability to sort of demonstrate it clearly and consistently, and we're not stuck trying to show people with these like cryptic tickets that don't have much commentary in the text and just got closed as approved with no real explanation. Awkward. We also need to be able to demonstrate that like to our internal audit teams or folks like that. Lastly, and probably most importantly, we are trying to reduce the cycle time for approvals, right? This is what our organization wants, right? How do we make this thing go faster? And one of the ways that one of the things we're trying to solve is to avoid the sort of situation where we've gone back and forth requesting information. We need information from the third party, and they give us some chicken feed. And we say, well, we need more information, and they give us more chicken feed. And then eventually you get to the point where you schedule that like dreaded call where it takes 4 weeks to put a 30-minute call on the calendar and 10 people show up with 15 minutes of talking points apiece. Like, let's not do that to ourselves. OK. Before I show you some results, I want to talk a little bit about the tools that we used. Most of this kind of began life with ChatGPT, but then I moved to an open source framework that our company has published called Goose. This is not a pitch for Goose. Even if it was, 10% of 0 is still 0. But Goose takes AI agents like from OpenAI or Anthropic or other agents like that as sort of the engine for it, but has a lot of extensibility and support for what's called the Model Context Protocol, or MCP, which is really just a way for us to connect an AI to tools and data like Jira or Slack or GitHub or Google Drive or things like that. You could probably accomplish similar things with whatever tools you have at your disposal, but I just wanted to kind of disclose what we used here. OK, let's look at something real. And I apologize. It occurred to me somewhat late in the game that browser-based LLMs are, in fact, a terrible spectator sport. But this is, if you're familiar with ChatGPT, you've probably seen a screen that looks like this before. This is the custom GPT edit window that you're seeing up there and probably squinting at, where I'm directing this particular GPT to take some inputs, such as the audit report or the developer documentation URL, and then evaluate them against our frameworks, right? And in the text, you're going to be like, what's that PAL or that DSL thing that Jacob is nattering on about? Those are our internal frameworks. Again, that's a rabbit hole. We're not going to fall down that. And I have, in fact, attached them to this GPT. It's just like below where the screenshot ends. But the point is that it consumes the inputs, evaluates it against those frameworks that I've attached, and then spits out some output for us to evaluate in a table. OK, so I have done some Crayola redaction of the individual provider here, but you can see what the results look like. It's a fairly orderly-looking table that talks about the control categories and the individual controls in our framework that we wanted to assess, and then some discussion of the results. And it looks pretty good, right? I mean, it's hard to read, and it's not pretty, but it seems plausible. What I will say is that these attempts were very, very, very positively predisposed towards the providers meeting our requirements. It was really cheerful about it. And even when the third parties I was testing this on clearly didn't meet the requirements, it would sort of end its analysis with, here are the quick wins that they could do to meet your control requirements. It was really rooting for these third parties. But I don't want a world where we just have to take the AI's word for it. I want it to be able to do what every math teacher tells you, right? Show your work, cite your sources. I guess that's your English teacher. But show how you got there. And that's when things started to go off the rails. OK. I'm not going to show you any of the really screwy results that I got, not because I'm ashamed of them. I'm a little bit ashamed of them. But it would take me 10 more slides to do that, and we just don't have time. But I can categorize our troubles into a few different sort of sections, right? One is the variable results. This should not surprise anybody, right? You give the LLM the same prompt 5 times, you get 5 different answers. And sometimes that variation, even if it's just formatting the results, is troublesome, particularly if it affects your downstream workflow. So that was kind of one category. One is that these AIs generally can only handle so many instructions before they start to unravel a little bit. And when you give it a lot of directives at once, it starts to kind of pick and choose. It's a little bit like when I give my kids some cleaning tasks in the house, and I say, here are these 5 things I want you to do. And then I go do my tasks for an hour, and I come back, and they're flopped on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, totally spent, and they've done maybe 2 of the things that I've asked them to do. Come on, guys. Now, some of the things that it just ignored or didn't do were not that crucial. I gave it some like really pie-in-the-sky kinds of examples at first, like compare these results to their industry peers, or give me some good follow-up questions, stuff you could live without. But other things were more crucial, like it would take the table of our controls that was in that framework that we wrote, and it would answer most of them, right? And sometimes it would just like cut some out, like, yeah, I'm not going to answer that. And sometimes it would take a couple of them and like muddle them together into some plausible sounding composite. But I could get it some of the time to like rerun, giving it a directive like, no, follow each individual control as I have written it, do not vary the wording, right? Like when I tell my middle schooler to do the dishes, like, no, unload the dishwasher and put the dishes away and then load the dirty dishes and then run the dishwasher and then scrub the things that can't be dishwashed. Like, what every parent in the room knows what I'm talking about. I love that boy. Okay, and that worked sort of most of the time, right? But once I started saying, no, cite your sources. Tell me how you got there. What is the thing in the SOC 2 that convinced you that this control in our framework was met? That's when things got really strange. Now, it did a couple of interesting things. Sometimes it would take like a really brief kind of throwaway statement in an audit report, like there's a policy that requires SSO for authentication, and it would hang a whole bunch of controls on that, right? Like, oh, yes, the control that you asked for that explicitly prohibits password-based authentication. Yeah, totally met. Or does it integrate with SCIM? Yeah, absolutely it does. Or can you do custom roles in your SSO? Sure, all that, no problem. I mean, in that way, it acted like a very junior auditor where it was taking all these controls and hanging them on this very slender thread. And in some ways, that was the most human-like behavior I watched, but probably for very different reasons. Hilariously, though, is when it would just outright fabricate things. Sometimes I would say, OK, well, tell me what SOC 2 control number actually showed you this thing. And it would give me a SOC 2 control number that had nothing to do with the topic at hand, or a SOC 2 control number that straight up did not exist in the report. Oh, yeah. This cryptographic thing that you want, it's in 6.8.4. And I go look through the report, and 6.8.1, 6.8.2, and that's it. Right? Like, come on, guys. And when I would prompt it again, it was very apologetic about that, but the damage was done. OK, so some of the culprits for how things went wrong are fairly obvious. The too many directives per prompt, pretty obvious. Like, we know how these things work. But I think there were some context collisions that were actually sort of subtle. In our framework, we have controls. And in audit reports, we have controls. And they are kind of mostly the same thing for the purposes of what we're trying to accomplish here, but they're subtly different. And I think an AI can get hung up on like really subtle context variations like that. It can also get hung up on context things in sort of the usage, right? A lot of like SOC 2 audit reports, when they talk about single sign-on, talk about that organization's users using SSO to authenticate to their systems. And we're talking about how does their product integrate with our SSO. Not exactly the same thing. And like normal, reasonable humans will get confused by that. So it's not hard to imagine that an LLM will do that too. But also there's, I think, a pretty strong bias away from I don't know, or I can't answer that given the information, right? Particularly when there were controls that I did not think the test provider met, or that their audit report would talk about, or any of the other information we had would directly address the thing. And what I wanted it to tell me was, I can't tell, right? Or I'm not sure, there's not enough information here. It was so like biased against that it would like concoct some fairy tale rather than just say, sorry, can't help you. OK, so I needed to change tack a little bit here. This is where I switched from ChatGPT to Goose, although mostly I went to Goose to get access to some of our underlying tools and data more easily. This is also a little bit later on where I started to use Google's Notebook LM, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But Notebook LM gives really interesting analysis. It's very like sober and cogent and doesn't hallucinate quite as much. But its output is harder to use, right? Like it just sort of spits the text into the like response box in the web interface, unless you inexplicably, I don't know, want a podcast that talks about the analysis. But the other things that I tried to do, one, were to take these like big complex tasks and like decompose them into smaller pieces, and then run the LLM on each of those like decomposed sections. And lastly, I admit I put my thumb on the scale, and so for each of these tasks, I would try to tell it, this particular control you are more likely to get from the developer documentation, so look there. And this control you were more likely to get from the audit report, so look there. Right? Rather than have it get confused with too many choices, try to direct it a little more precisely. OK, and so now I've gone from like a text-dense, hard-to-read browser to a text-dense, hard-to-read markdown file because I'm a genius who loves destroying his own eyesight. But you can see here it kind of organized the same set of controls or a similar set of controls. It gave responses like a pass, fail, and then it tried to cite some evidentiary kind of information about how it got there. And again, like a lot of these are pass, if you can kind of squint and see pass, 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 pass. It meets all these controls. Like it was giving a very generous kind of reading of our control framework. And if you knew me as an assessor, you know I don't do generous readings of the controls. So I wanted to tighten that up a little bit. And what I could do is prompt the agent to run it again and say, this time interpret our control framework very strictly, and then go look at your first pass and revise it. And the result, you can sort of see in the right-hand frame of the slide, is that then it's the same provider, it's the same thing, but it's failed a whole bunch of those controls that it said passed 5 minutes ago. So I got much more accuracy that way, which is to say, like, it failed more controls. But what I wasn't able to do was figure out how to skip that step and say, just do it right the first time. And I'm not sure why, but that's what happens, right? So I did get fewer sort of erratic results, and fewer, fantasy concoctions, but not zero. OK, so we're getting close to time, and I want to sort of give some useful lessons learned here. I will also say that we had to put these slides together in June, and we haven't stood still since then. So a bunch of other work has been done, other avenues that we're exploring, including using a third party's AI platform to do these analyses of our third parties. And there's a particularly sort of delicious irony in that. But the preliminary results are positive or promising at least. But as far as lessons learned, I would try to distill them into a few categories. One is more iterations, right? Run your individual task a couple of different times and try to smooth out the results. You'll get potentially fewer hallucinations that way and reduce that sort of variability across an LLM instance. Another piece of advice I give you is pick your battles. Choose the things that are the most important. Cut out the directives that aren't essential to you. And then be really careful with your prompting. Kind of think about the language a little bit, right? Try to avoid overloaded or contextually problematic terms. In our case, control was one of them, and that may or may not be a problem for you. But think about how meaning or context applies. The more times you have to run the prompt, right, the more times you say, do this again, but subtly vary it, the less repeatable your process is downstream. I did say at the beginning of this talk that you can probably accomplish these results with whatever platform you want. I still think that's mostly true, but there are platform trade-offs. NotebookLM was very good, but harder to use the output, right? ChatGPT, the output was actually pretty easy to use, or like Goose, using, I think, Anthropic was really easy to use the output because I could then have it just write a Google Doc directly, but I got more hallucinations. And then lastly, what I would say is really focus on what your goal is, right? Our goal was never to have the coolest AI, but it was to improve the sort of labor saving and scalability of a process that was fundamentally driven by humans. And so a really cool AI that does not work with your workflow or cannot transform your workflow into the next new thing doesn't actually help you as much as maybe you think it does. So stay focused on what's really important. And I would also say start small and iterate very carefully, right? So think through what you want to accomplish, how can you slice that into the smallest set of tasks, and then work your way up from there rather than throw the whole kitchen sink at the AI and see if it can solve it for you overnight. So that's what I've got. Thank you very much. I would love to talk with anybody who wants to explore this. I'll be here through the rest of the conference. Thank you.